Hello, and thank you for tuning in to The Christian Skeptic. I'm your host, Sean Kerwin, and as always, it's my mission to take an honest look at our questions about Christianity through the lens of logic and reason. I'm not here to preach at you, just to start a conversation with you. I hope you enjoy the show. So what comes to mind when I say the word church? Maybe there's some good memories of the family, the community that you grew up with, hanging out as a kid in youth group, going on mission trips, and that's great. And maybe there's some bad memories. Maybe there's some bad memories of a very legalistic church. Maybe there's some bad memories of a church full of people that turned a blind eye to someone that abused you, or you had to watch someone get abused and you felt powerless. Maybe it's corruption. Maybe it's generosity. Maybe it's shallow and fake cliques. Maybe it's the deepest, most loving connection you've ever known. Either way, good and bad, you can probably look at whatever church you've been a part of or observed over your life and say, that's not the true church. That's not how church was intended to be, at least from what we understand of it in the Bible. And fair enough. I think that there's a reality to the fact that we need to mourn these things. And I was thinking about that, right? That church doesn't always turn out the way we want it to be, but our career doesn't always turn out the way we want it to be, and our family doesn't always turn out the way we want it to be, and our friendships don't always turn out the way we want it to be, and our love lives, our relationships, our marriages don't always turn out the way we want it to be. Our communities, our politics, actually nothing in this world turns out the way we want it to be. And I think the best picture of that is from Ecclesiastes chapter 4, where Solomon says, again, I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold, the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors, there was power, and there was no one to comfort them. And I thought, the dead, who are already dead, more fortunate than the living who are still alive, but better than both is he who has not yet been and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun. Then I saw that all the toil and all the skill in work come from man's envy of his neighbor. This is also vanity and striving after the wind. The fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. Better is a handful of quietness than 2 handfuls of toil and a striving after the wind. And so, as I was getting ready to record this episode on why should we still go to church, I was pulling up all these statistics and all these psychological facts, and that's all well and good, and we're going to get to that, but I think there's also a reality that just like Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes, there are tears of the oppressed and no one to comfort them. And there's power on the side of oppressors and no one to comfort you who are powerless. That so many people toil and skill out of envy. So much of life, and even church life, is about being the one on top, being the better person. And all that does is leave you empty. And the people that are supposed to show you in this world the most how to be fulfilled are themselves unfulfilled. So can we just sit for a minute at the start of this episode and say that's not how it's supposed to be? And recognize that there needs to be a mourning. Before we even broach the subject of why should I be in church, I think there needs to be a mourning, a grieving that your church experience, that my church experience has not been what it should have been. See, in Zechariah, he talks about a day when the Messiah comes and everyone will be holy, everyone will be filled with the Shekinah glory of God, and every bridle for a horse, every bowl will be made holy. They'll write on it that this is an instrument used to serve God. This is an instrument used to love God and love others, and that day is still coming. It's here because of the Holy Spirit, and everyone who believes in Jesus can have the Holy Spirit, the Shekinah glory of God filling them, and every tool, if you offer it to God, can be used to love God and love your neighbor, but it's also not yet because we screw it up, and there is oppression in church and in Christian communities, and we get it wrong. And we need to grieve that. It's not okay that you had that experience, but it's okay that that experience affected you the way it did. The question we need to ask now is, what is the thing we need to do next to move forward? Or as Dr. John Deloney always says, what's the next right thing we need to do? Because the past as horrible as it was, is in the past now. And so, one more Bible reference, and then we'll jump into the statistics and psychological argument for why you should go to church. I was listening to a sermon that Tim Keller gave this morning, as I often do in the mornings when I make my breakfast and my coffee, and it was over Nehemiah chapter 3, and it's a strange passage to give a sermon over, and I'm not going to repeat the sermon, but it goes over who built what. So Nehemiah is the king's cupbearer over in Medo-Persia, and he gets a call to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the wall. He feels a burden for his people. And Nehemiah chapter 3 just says who built the wall. It says who built what region beyond the river, and next to him was someone that made repairs to the goldsmith's house and the perfumer's house, and the part of the wall that was by the water gate, and next to them were so-and-so, and next to them were so-and-so. And Keller makes a point that phrase, next to them, is said over and over and over and over again in that chapter, and that as Nehemiah is a picture of Jesus who is to come and be the ultimate Nehemiah and build an ultimate city for his people that's protected not with a physical wall against others, but with a spiritual wall against sin, that the people are a picture of the church and what it should be later on, that next to each other, we build up our spirituality and we do the work of God. And there are many other arguments in the Bible for why you should go to church. There's Paul saying, do not forsake the assembling together of yourselves, as some are in the habit of doing, but all the more as you see the day approaching, the day that Christ returns, encourage one another, exhort one another. Jesus himself said he would build a church and the gates of hell wouldn't prevail against it. But I'm not oblivious to the fact that over 50% of Americans who call themselves Christians also say they practice their Christianity alone and do not attend a church. So where does that leave us? Well, that leaves us anxious and depressed. That leaves us not fully processing our mental health. You know, there's an interesting scene in Shakespeare's Macbeth where Lady Macbeth is having her night terrors, right? And she's there, the doctor and her handmaid are there, and they're not sure if she's sleepwalking, but she's trying to wash the blood from her hands and there's no blood. And the doctor turns to the maidservant and he says, I don't know that I have a medication to solve this mental ill. I think she needs divine intervention. And I'm paraphrasing because he says it in Shakespearean language. And I'm like, you know what, that there's something there that when you just try to solve life and solve your problems alone, you're trying to wash the blood off your hands and it isn't even there in some way. But let's jump off the philosophical and off the ethereal here for a second, because the CDC actually points to there being strong evidence that attending religious services increases both happiness and life satisfaction. That those who attend religious services find a greater sense of meaning and purpose in their life, and they're more likely also to have social support, which in turn means they have stronger coping mechanisms. And that's from a post-COVID study that was done in 2021. In 2016, CNN also published a study where researchers looked at data on approximately 75,000 middle-aged female nurses in the United States, and I'm just reading it right now, as a part of the Nurses' Health Study. The participants answered questions about whether they attended religious services regularly every 4 years between 1992 and 2012, and about other aspects of their lives over the years. The researchers found that the women in this study who went to church more than once a week had a 33% lower risk of dying during the study period with those who said they never went. And women who attended once a week or less had a 26% and a 13%, respectively, lower risk of death. The study found that regular church attendance could, but didn't always, promote self-discipline and a sense of meaning and purpose in life. However, there were potential negative effects such as guilt, anxiety, or intolerance, but this is a quote, our study suggests that for health, the benefits outweigh the potential negative effects. One of the possible reasons that supports this could be what Vanderbilt University found in one of their studies, where they worked with the CDC and the National Center for Health Statistics. What they looked at is a person's allostatic load while attending worship services. Now, allostatic load is a physiological measurement of factors including cardiovascular factors, which is like your blood pressure, your cholesterol, high density lipoprotein ration, and homocysteine. And I hope I'm saying all this right. Your nutritional and inflammatory factors, which included albumin, C-reactive protein, your metabolic factors, which included waist to hip ratio, and glycated hemoglobin measures. So what's helpful to understand here is the higher the allostatic load, the more stress an individual was interpreted as being. So they studied 5,449 people of all races and both sexes, and of those people, 64% of them were regular worship service attenders, so regular worshipers, which means that 46% of them were non-worshipers. Overall, they found that the 46% non-worshipers had a higher overall allostatic load, and on average, 3 out of the 10 markers for allostatic load were at risk for the 46% of non-churchgoers. And this study didn't even take into account the frequency of worship. So there isn't even something there that says you have to attend it once a week. And so what am I saying here? Am I saying that if you go to church, you won't have any mental illness? You won't have any mental health problems? No, there are statistics on that as well. Some of these might shock you. I'm just going to read the list here. So 23% of pastors acknowledge they have personally struggled with a mental illness. 49% of pastors say they rarely or never speak to their congregation about mental illness. Only 27% of churches have a plan to assist families affected by mental illness. 65% of church-going family members of those with mental illness want their church to talk openly about mental illness. 59% of those actually suffering from mental illness say the same. 53% of churchgoers with mental illness say the church has been supportive. 76% of churchgoers say suicide is a problem that needs to be addressed in their community. 32% of churchgoers say a close acquaintance or family member has died by suicide. 80% of pastors, though, say that their church is equipped to assist someone who is threatening to take his or her own life. And 92% of pastors say their church is equipped to care for the family that experiences the suicide of a loved one. But only 4% of churchgoers who lost a loved one to suicide say church leaders were even aware of their loved one's struggles. 68% of Americans feel they would be welcome in church if they were mentally ill. 35% of Americans say mental illness could be overcome with Bible study and prayer alone. And I'm not going to argue whether these statistics are true. I think some of those are up for debate. But nevertheless, that's the data. So what does this mean? Well, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know if I fully have a detailed, loaded in the barrel, ready to pull the trigger answer of why you should attend church. What I do think I have is a process of elimination that we can run through. And maybe just a format for process of elimination that you can continue to run through. Based on the data, based on what the Bible says, and I say this with the caveat of everything I said at the first episode still ringing very true in my heart and mind right now, that I know that there's church hurt, but the answer can't be to stop going to church. It just can't be. Like, people suck. And I've had friends betray me and never want to speak to me again. And I know you probably have too, but I don't stop ever making friends with anybody just because one friend hurt me, right? Like, the answer is not to just abandon friendship. I've had my heart broken in a relationship before. I know many of you have as well. And at the point that happened, I could have just sworn off dating forever, but that wasn't the answer that was ultimately going to lead to my happiness. And so if all these statistics are true about church, that if you attend a worship service on a weekly basis, you're 33% less likely to die early, that all of your stress levels and your anxiety and everything will go down to one degree or another simply by being involved in church community and involved in just the practice of worship, then the answer can't be to just not attend church. And the crazy thing is we're so wired for community that these studies just looked at attendance. They didn't even really look at what a person believes. And that's kind of the part that stuck out to me the most, is that these studies were very non-religious. Maybe in like the greatest sense, right? Because essentially, if I'm reading this and I'm not a religious person, I can look at these studies and say, I want these benefits and attend a church service. And I'm going somewhere with this. I'm biased because one of my favorite philosophers, Friedrich Nietzsche, would attend church weekly, even though he hated God. And not just him, but many philosophers, many psychologists, many thinkers, atheist thinkers would actually attend church services regularly. And so this isn't a revolutionary thing I'm proposing here. And so maybe there's something there that somehow will assert itself as an answer in your life. And I'm being vague on purpose because I don't know your community. Hell, I barely know my community. Part of the process of elimination is going and trying things and eliminating the things that don't work, but you can't just eliminate everything. So at some point you have to decide on something. And in my mind, I go back to the picture that is painted in the actual lives and deeds of the people in Nehemiah's day that next to each other rebuilt the wall. Every brick would remind them that this wall was destroyed because they screwed up and because oppressors hurt them. But what was the alternative for them? Just to sit in the rubble of Jerusalem and cry and wait for the next set of oppressors to come and take advantage of them and kill them? No. The answer was to put a sword in one hand and a shovel in the other, as Nehemiah writes. And I say this again because I want you to know you're not the only one with church hurt. I want you to know you're not the only one who has run across an oppressor and a bully and an evildoer. Many of us have. And maybe we can rebuild something next to one another. Because here's the reality. As much as you want anxiety to go down, it needs to be replaced with something, and that something should probably be fulfillment. And I think a lot of the leading psychology experts and the philosophy of our day, which I think is true, would say that your highest levels of fulfillment are when you're doing something good that serves you and serves other people. That we need to be actively looking for opportunities to help each other out and serve one another. And one of the best places for that to happen is in a church community, in a church setting. And I know church gets weird, and pastors get weird with the way they teach, and programs are weird, and women's gatherings are weird, and men's retreats are kind of cringy, and they're often around fishing or something, and I hate fishing. Like, no offense if you love it, but man, I really hate it. You're like, they sell fish at the grocery store. Why am I going to spend 8 hours floating down a river in a tiny little boat eating a crappy peanut butter sandwich because male bonding? Anyway, I digress. I don't know that that needs to be a part of the process of elimination is where I'm going, though. People are quirky. People are weird, right? You're quirky and weird, too. And all of your hobbies shouldn't be turned into church programs either. I know all of mine shouldn't be. But I know, and I think you know too, in my heart of hearts and your heart of hearts, that somewhere in your community, there is a church community with people that are willing to pick up those bricks that were thrown down by oppressors, that remind you and me of our failures, mourn and grieve the loss of what should have been, but what was and you can't change now, and build something new. And I think if there's a community of people out there that are willing to do that, and willing to do that centered around, and I think this is the key to church community over other communities, is that church community is centered around what Carl Jung would refer to as the highest spiritual ideal you can possibly pursue, and what Christians refer to as the gospel. That's a pretty solid foundation to build something new on. I almost said rebuild just there, and I think that that's incorrect. You don't need to rebuild the trauma of the past. It's done. It's dead. Build something new. C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, Owen Barfield, and Charles Williams got together and formed a group of friends, a group of writers called the Inklings. And they were together for all of their lives, until the end of their lives. And Lewis writes in his book, The Four Loves, about the death of Charles Williams. Well, he writes about friendship. But in this, he references the death of Charles. And he says, in each of my friends, there is something that only some other friend can fully bring out. By myself, I am not large enough to call the whole man into activity. I want other lights than my own to show all his facets. Now that Charles is dead, I shall never again see Ronald's reaction to a specifically Caroline joke. Far from having more of Ronald, having him to myself now that Charles is away, I have less of Ronald. We possess each friend not less, but more, as the number of those with whom we share him increases. And this is more so an argument for community than for church. But I think they go hand in hand because a church should be a community. And if it's not, eliminate that church from your options and go find one that is. But you will only find yourself in community. You will only find yourself the way you reflect the light out of other people. Just like C.S. Lewis said, he'll never hear Tolkien laugh again the way he would laugh at one of Charles's jokes. That there was a part of Tolkien that only came out when Charles was around. And a true healthy church community will help you reveal who you are by having many people around to pull out all the sides of you. And this brings me back to something that I've said again and again on this podcast. But Jesus said, greater love has none than this, that a man should lay down his life for his not church community, not family, not lovers, not servants, not worshipers. He says, greater love has none than this, that a man should lay down his life for his friends. The essence of Christianity is friendship. Friendship with God and friendship with each other. To the degree that you're in church community is the degree that you'll understand the beauty, the complexity, and the divine nature of friendship. And it's hard to find that church, to find those friends in that church. But keep searching because it's worth it. You're worth it. The doctrine of Christianity says the only way to truly find yourself, to find out who you are, is to find other people and find out who they are. So yeah, those are my thoughts. I hope that they help. Maybe they'll stir some thoughts in your mind. If they do, and you want to talk about it, let's continue the conversation. Drop a comment, shoot me an email or a message somehow. And as always, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed the show.